You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Good evening. You are listening to CFRC broadcast to you on the FM dial in the Kingston area at 101.9 FM and streaming live at cfrc.ca. My name is Ben. Welcome to What on Earth is Going On? Every Thursday at 6 p.m., we take you beneath the headlines in Canada and around the world to identify the events, the characters, the forces, and the ideas that shape the human story today. We ask why things are happening, how they might have come to be, and where we might all be headed. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or contributions to the ongoing discussion, please get in touch. You can find the show on social media by looking up the acronym WOGO, that's WOEGO for What on Earth is Going On, or by finding WOGO Show on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. I would love to hear your thoughts. On tonight's program, we're going to start off with a look at some interesting pieces of news that you might have missed from your media diet, and then we're going to talk a little bit about today's subject before launching into our feature interview with Dr. Rob Beamish, professor of sociology at Queen's University. What are we going to talk about? Well, we're going to talk about Karl Marx, of course, because who doesn't want to talk about Karl Marx for an hour? In fact, who doesn't want to talk about Karl Marx for 2 hours? And because the answer to that question is obviously nobody, this show is actually going to be part 1 of 2. So, here are a few items in the news that you might have missed. California became the first U.S. state to require all new homes to have solar power. Taking effect in 2020, the requirement is expected to add between $8,000 and $12,000 to the cost of a new home, but should also add a great deal of renewable capacity to California's grid in the long run. Now, one thing I'm not sure about here are the requirements for batteries. Economists have argued that solar power is critical for the future, but that it must be paired with energy storage, such as plugged-in electric car batteries that can smooth out energy use in cloudy weather or at night. Also, speaking of technology, Amazon launched a new service in 37 U.S. cities that will soon expand, presumably to Canada, in which deliveries can be made to the trunk of your car for no additional cost as long as you live in one of the cities and can open your trunk remotely. Amazon will deliver your stuff to your vehicle. The feature is designed in part to increase convenience, but also to prevent theft, as many packages are stolen from people's front porches. The story begs the question of how not just delivery logistics, but the whole realm of shopping will change going forward. Delivery by flying drone is really not too far off. Now, May 5th would have been the 200th birthday of Karl Marx, an enormously influential German economist and philosopher who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto of 1848, as well as numerous other works, including the unfinished yet still monumental Das Kapital, or Capital. There seems to be a resurgence of interest in Marx's thought, especially since the recession of 2008 and 9. We're going to dig into the details of Marx's life and influence later on in the program, but before we do, I wanted to lay a bug in your ear. What are your preconceptions of Marx, of socialism, of communism? Is it all a defeated ideology, a relic of history that we can study from a distance? Even China is communist today in name only. But make no mistake, Marxism may be dead, but Marx is very much alive and kicking. The communist internationals may no longer be hosted, but Marx's insight into the way the world works has profoundly influenced academia, economics, government, social programs, the way we study and view history, and, yes indeed, capitalism itself. We may not be Marxist, but many of the foundations of our world and the way in which we conceive of it are built from Marx's material. Okay, Dr. Rob Beamish is a professor of sociology at Queen's University and has done extensive research into sport, the American anthropologist and ethnologist Lawrence Crater, and of course the development of Karl Marx's ideas. One of his earliest publications is Marx, Method, and the Division of Labor back in 1992, and recently he published The Promise of Sociology in its second edition, and you can find this book at Amazon. Dr. Beamish, glad to have you here.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, welcome to the show. So my first question is always the big one, the heavy-hitting question. We have a lot of stuff going on in the world right now. We've got the virtual economy. We've got a new definition for the proletariat that we call sometimes the precariat now. We have massive disturbance politically, economically, culturally. It seems like we're living in a new time. It seems like the pages have turned, but it also seems like if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly does rhyme. So from the perspective of your work, especially from Karl Marx, what on earth is going on?
Okay, that is a very good and profound question. So I think the first thing that's going on is, as you've already mentioned, we're in a time of social change, but mostly social instability. And so in periods of social instability, people's minds turn to earlier thinkers who dealt with periods that are similar to ours. So in that way, Marx, I think, has become a relevant figure for people to to address and wrestle with. Secondly, the financial crisis of 2008 gave us a very powerful sense that the economy is perhaps more fragile than people had ever imagined. And with that particular meltdown, the fear was, will the capitalist economy ever recover? And if not, what will take its place? And so again, there was, I think, a revival of interest in Marx because of his ideas that the capitalist economy has its own inherent contradictions. So I think that that's part of the reason that people have started to think, wow, maybe we need to look at at Karl Marx. And I guess then the third point I would make is there has been such a strong presence of neoliberalism. So the work of F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and they rely on an image of an economy that runs as a laissez-faire economy that is sort of outlined by Adam Smith. And then now we see that the laissez-faire economy, has its own inherent problems. And so you're then led, I think, pretty automatically to, well, who considered the inherent contradictions that Smith had overlooked, and that would be the work of Marx.
Okay, so before we get into the key ideas of Karl Marx, let's first ask the question, what are those inherent contradictions that you mentioned?
Okay, so I guess the inherent contradictions are in some ways very obvious, and that is what we see now is a far greater growing and significantly growing inequality within the social system. There are some individuals, largely finance capitalists, who are becoming enormously wealthy, whereas the real incomes of the so-called middle class are declining. And so that growth of inequality is one thing that I think has become problematic. And then secondly, the idea of globalization. So Marx dealt with issues of globalization, but as our economies have become globalized, then work that used to be done within North America now is being done in other regions of the world. Right. And so that too has put people in positions of precarity. So when you talk about a proletariat or a precariat, part of the role of the precariat or the dilemmas they face is that we no longer think of, as my father could and I could, of a long career. We think really of finding employment, holding on to employment, and then looking for better employment. So the sort of circumstances for our everyday life experiences now are being really dramatically shaped by a precarious economic situation, which then is, I think, exacerbated by the precarious political association or situation that we have now, particularly with the election of Donald Trump and his, penchant for making outrageous decisions because he thinks he's right, even though all of his informed advisors would say don't do that, and so he's just replaced informed advisors with uninformed ones.
Right. It's hard not to think of Donald Trump and Brexit and populism and these rising issues in the world when we ask the question, what on earth is going on? And just to position this maybe in Marxist terms, or at least economic terms, it seems that the rise of inequality is definitely a part of one of the contradictions of capitalism, but it seems that it's really accelerated recently over the last, say, 15 years or so, or maybe since the 1980s. And I think different people have different explanations for this. But what I read recently that was very interesting was that the post-World War II consensus was to compress living standards by focusing on labor over capital, so focusing on unemployment, making sure that we're dealing with that problem. But since the 1980s and the opening up of Reaganomics or Thatcherite ideals, we've broken that back down and focused back on capital, which has been exacerbated by the so-called digital age, or the virtual economy, which is all about capital. And then we can talk about automation and all those other things. Is that an accurate description of what's been happening and why it's accelerated?
Yeah, I think so. So Eric Hobsbawm, in his book on the short 20th century, argues that there was what he calls an age of catastrophe. So from 1900 up until the end of the Second World War, 1945, in which there was tremendous instability. At the end of the Second World War, so from 1945, and he dates it really to about 1973, which is the first OPEC crisis.
Right.
But between 1945 and 1973, he calls that the Golden Age. And in that Golden Age, two things happen, I think, that are significant. One of them is that the war experience led governments to feel assured that they could play a vital role in the development of society, including becoming involved in the economy. And so although Keynes wrote the General Theory of Employment in 1932 and really wasn't much attention paid to it, by the time you get to the post-war period, his whole idea of the economy in and of itself will not produce full employment, that an economy needs to have some way of creating effective aggregate demand, which means essentially there has to be enough consumption of the things produced that all things that are produced are being sold, and therefore capital gets its return, but also that the economy can expand. And what he shows in the theory of unemployment is that the economy by itself won't do that. There has to be some role played by an external factor. So he sees government playing that role. Now, in some ways, it may have been just a coincidence that you have the post-war period where there's an enormous amount of rebuilding and Keynesian economics because the economy does grow and real wages do grow all the way through until the early 1960s, when wages then start to stagnate. The problem was that governments, in order to be elected, put forward social programs that they then borrowed heavily on. So when the economy started to downturn, particularly in 1973, governments were in a precarious position. So it then gave the opportunity for the neoliberals, those who follow von Hayek and von Mises, to argue, well, governments are inefficient. The only way you can run an economy is to base it on, so-called economic indicators. And so with government debt growing, instability within government at almost all levels, then it led to Reagan and Thatcher coming to power, arguing, take government out, make government small, let the economy run on its own. And the outcome of that, unfortunately, was that they deregulated a whole lot of areas of the economy, including the financial sector. And so the deregulation of the financial sector, which really means putting less and less controls on how finance capital invests money, led again to the precarious situation that ultimately by 2008 results in that tremendous global meltdown.
Right. Back in I think around 2011, when the Occupy Wall Street movement kicked off, one of the key ideas at the time was that there are hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars slushing around the world, untaxed, unaccountable, whether they're kept in offshore bank accounts or they're put in countries where taxation is irrelevant because they want that investment in that country, and that all of this money is essentially being hoarded by the wealthy and not taxed, and we can call this redistribution of wealth. But those of us who don't have the ability to put our money in some slush fund obviously are left in the cold.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, that I think is important for people to recognize is when the economy centered on the production of material goods, people could see the goods that they were purchasing. So, Smith's idea of caveat emptor, buyer beware, made sense in an economy where we're purchasing material goods. And so all through that period, and you can think of this, that, if you're going to Canadian Tire and buying a hammer, you can pick the hammer up and you look and you can compare 3 or 4 different hammers and say, yeah, this hammer is going to do the job.
Right.
Then when you move to something that's a little more complex, so think about a car, when you're looking at cars, we have a sense of, closing the doors, kicking the tires, that there are parts of the car we think, oh yeah, that's good, I know that. Now we also know there are parts of cars that we just don't understand, so then we take it on the word of the salesman or salesperson that, yeah, this is a good vehicle. And you read consumer reports, and so you get some idea of, well, this will be a worthwhile car, so I'll buy this as opposed to something else. And then think of a computer. And with a computer, at least for me, and probably I think even for young millennials and Generation Z and Z kids, they know what a computer is, but they have no idea how it actually operates.
Right.
And so they're relying completely on the insight of whatever consumer reports there are, whatever they can get off of the web. So they are buying something largely on the advice of others. The reason why I'm saying all this is when you come to finance markets, what's happened now is finance products that became so saleable became more and more and more complex. And so finance capital was able to, through different hedge fund salespeople, et cetera, to sell products that people say, okay, based on what you're telling me, it sounds like a good investment. And that then has led to enormous once you saturate the market, you have to find another product to sell and another product to sell, and they become more and more precarious. So once one of those precarious products collapses, if there's a huge investment in that, then that falls quickly. But the individuals who are involved in those finance operations, they get rewarded on the basis of sales. So if they can sell lots, they can get huge salaries, commissions, and CEOs then benefit from that the most. So you do have the top 1% making enormous salaries, but really, when you look at the top 1% of that 1%, that's where the billionaires are,
right.
And they're the ones who have been able to most benefit. It is almost like a Ponzi scheme, but most benefit from the shift towards finance capital, allowing capital to have free reign, and the deregulation of the economy, which has created huge dilemmas.
And I think when you talk about making things, whether they're material or they're complex material or they're something that you can download off the internet, which isn't so much material as virtual, there's another aspect to all this too, which is brand and marketing. And I've read a little bit about how the whole idea of marketing, about selling not just a product but a lifestyle that Coca-Cola in the 20th century made so famous, actually distorts the whole market and does something that Marx in the 19th century couldn't possibly have predicted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the power of advertising, but mostly the power of the media. And and again, virtual media have been, I'm trying to think of the word I need here, but anyway, ingenious, I guess. Ingenious in that they've been able to make us virtually addicted to, all the different mobile devices that we have. So the creation of mobile devices now allow us virtually 24/7 to have information. And I actually will say that I don't have a cell phone. Mainly because I don't think I really need one, but I do have an iPad. And, I can find myself, in the evening sitting down and picking up my iPad, opening it up, flipping to something, just to have something to read. And then thinking, I've read everything that's on this. I've read all the CBC News. I've read, and then closing it and thinking, why did I do that? And then I realized that within, the new digital age, that there are so many ways to try to create the desire to go back and look at it again. And that means then that we're being continually exposed to all the advertising that is there. And it is, way back, in the 1960s, Vance Packard wrote a book called The Hidden Persuaders, which which was all about how different images are embedded within print advertising to entice us to consume.
Right.
Well, digital technology. Facebook would be a very good example of that, is able to integrate into our everyday living experiences, advertisements that we think we don't pay attention to, but we actually do. And they then draw us into consuming things tied to lifestyle.
We all believe, of course, that we're not susceptible to advertising, but if we all were right, then how could there possibly be such a massive... advertising is one of the biggest businesses in the world. And I think you're right. I think, back to when I was a kid, 1990s and 2000s, a bag of Doritos or Lay's chips, bet you can't eat just one. You knew that this stuff was chemically designed for you to eat as much as you possibly could, to the detriment of anything except for how much money you spend on it and how much you can actually invest in another bag of chips. And that has extended to cell phones, where the power not just of programmers in Silicon Valley, but artificial intelligence. I mean, we're talking about a future in which companies like Apple or Facebook or Google will be able to control your desires better than you know your desires yourself, almost to the point that your free will itself has eroded. And I think that actually, I was reading something recently that I think Marx predicted a little bit of this, that we are essentially becoming automatons to the consumer buying, selling culture, that we're nothing except producers and consumers. Which brings me to a segue of Eric Hobsbawm that you mentioned earlier. One of the things that Eric Hobsbawm wrote in I'm not sure which book it was, but one of the things he wrote about Marx is that he provided a great diagnosis for capitalism, but not the best prognosis or not the best prescription of what to do about it. And that's almost universally agreed upon in modern academia, or even, as you were talking about, in the leaders who are essentially ruling the neoliberal world. But I wanted to go back to Marx for a second through Eric Hobsbawm. May 5th was the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth in Trier in Germany. He was born in 1818. So before we keep going down this rabbit hole, let's just ground this a little bit. Who was Karl Marx? And then we can talk about the impacts that he had.
Yeah. Okay. So in many ways, Karl Marx was not very different from you and me. He was a young guy that grew up in Trier. So this is 1818. Families were fairly large, but the idea of all children living to adulthood, wasn't expected. So I think there were 9 children in his family, 4 of whom grew to adulthood. He was a precocious kid who, his parents had chores for him, and he would tell wonderful stories to his younger sisters, and in exchange for the wonderful stories he told to his sisters, they would do his chores. He was what we would call now homeschooled until high school. His father was a lawyer. Mother was what we would now call a stay-at-home mom. He went off to the University of Bonn in 1835 at a pretty young age, 17, so same age as what our first-year students are. He engaged in campus life to the fullest, was arrested for drunken disorderly conduct, wounded in a duel, and his father wrote letters to him saying, "Karl, what are you doing? You're killing me." And so his father then moved him from the University of Bonn and I'm not sure what his father was thinking, but to the University of Berlin. Why he thought Berlin would be a quieter place where Marx would study more, I'm not sure, but that's what he did. His parents had aspirations for their son, as middle-class parents do, that Karl would become a lawyer just like his dad.
Right.
But at the University of Berlin, Marx got involved with Hegel was the philosopher of Germany at that point in time, and there were 2 readings of Hegel, a more conservative right-wing Hegelian reading and then a more progressive left-wing Hegelian reading. And Marx fell in line with the left Hegelian. So he was influenced by a sort of a radical rereading of Hegel's texts. And that led him to join what was called the Doctors' Club, which was a number of professors as well as graduate students. And Marx, being the precocious individual he was, fit in just very well. He, though, saw life as an academic. So he actually went on, and most people don't recognize this, but got a PhD from the University of Vienna in 1841, aspiring to be a university professor. Unfortunately, unfortunately perhaps for him at the time, his kind of sponsor, Bruno Bauer, who was again a young academic part of the Doctors Club, he and Marx penned a spoof that portrayed Hegel as the Antichrist, and that led to Bauer's expulsion from the University of Berlin. And so, without an academic sponsor, Marx then became a journalist. So, worked for the Rheinische Zeitung for a couple of years, became its editor. And really, it was there that he had to deal with municipal events. And so, focusing on municipal events, there were debates around really kind of entrenched laws. So, peasants were allowed to go into the common area, common land, and pick up wood. In picking up common wood, they could use that as fuel for their homes. Well, the municipality was now enclosing the commons, and so the picking up of wood became an illegal act. Right. So Marx wrote extensively on that. But what he argued was essentially two things. One was in confronting the real material conditions of people's existence, that changed his perspective. And secondly, his old Doctors Club friends would write articles for the Rheinische Zeitung about all the beauties of communism and the realization of this idea. So what Marx did was he sort of stated, I'm going to study all of the communist writings and then make my own assessment of it. He ends up being, the newspaper ends up being closed by the censors because it was seen as too radical. And so then Marx spends time, moves to Paris. He's sort of expelled from Germany and living amongst French and German workers. Again, gets a better sense of the material conditions of existence. So that experience moves him from Hegel to what becomes seen as, sort of historical materialism, or his own materialist understanding of history.
Just quickly, what is materialism?
So, and that's a good question, because materialism has a lot of different meanings attached to it, and Marx's materialism is interpreted in different ways. But I would argue that for Marx, his idea of materialism is understanding the everyday lived experiences of real individuals. Right. So real individuals, their activities, and their ideas. It's not a more fundamental idea than that. So there isn't some sort of aspect of the material world that dominates everything. When Marx died, Engels, in giving the graveside eulogy, said that just as Darwin discovered the natural laws of the organic world, Marx discovered the laws of the social world. And what people interpreted that as was Darwin discovered the whole idea of natural evolution tied to a natural world. And Marx's ideas then get tied into that sort of natural evolutionism leading to a revolution tied to material conditions. Right. Whereas I think Marx was more influenced by Hegel than, and Western Marxists have sort of recovered the Hegelian dimension of Marx's work. But it is this mediated understanding of how we interact with the world, create material forces of production within a set of social relations of production, and you have to understand those two things within the context of what Marx often called the superstructure, the political and intellectual processes of life overall. So when you bring all of those together, you get a sense of how our lived experiences shape how we think about the world around us, create contradictions that we then try to resolve on the basis of our understandings of the world as it exists at that point in time.
Seems pretty critical to our understanding of the world, whether today or back in 1848 or 1818. I'm trying to peel back how my lived experience will affect my understanding of the world. And to think that that idea might have been revolutionary at the time, because, of course, to say that you're a materialist is to say that you're not taking a religious explanation for something, or saying that the value of your life is about where you go in the afterlife, for example, or saying that there is an ideal human, so the Platonic ideal, as opposed to the real lived person that Marx was getting at. And I think it's so important for how we understand the way things are around us. You mentioned Engels, though,
Yep.
Friedrich Engels.
Yep.
And I think our listeners would probably know that Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx wrote together the Communist Manifesto. But what a lot of people don't know is that communism wasn't actually an invention by Karl Marx, as a lot of people would think with the Communist Manifesto. So let's just get this idea out of the way of communism. What is it, and where does it come from?
Okay, so the idea of communism and socialism has a very long history. You know, some people will argue that, you know, Jesus Christ was the first communist because he believed, you know, that we should be, you know, shedding all of our material goods, sharing things equally, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, etc. And I'll just talk a little bit about the manifesto itself, because it'll give the listeners a sense of where Marx stood within the discussions around communism. So there was a group of German emigres who lived in London. So London was a city that allowed people of different radical ideas to live there and freely express their ideas. So this group was the so-called League of the Just. The League of the Just wanted to explore ideas of communism and socialism. And in some senses, they wanted to form a political movement. And so they had a guy named Wilhelm Weitling write what was in some senses a programmatic statement for them. So Weitling was tied very much into a religious belief system. So the statement he wrote was mankind, or humankind as it is and as it ought to be. So you can get a sense of the kind of religious tones that document had. That was fine for a few years, but by 1845, the League of the Just wanted to reassess their position. So what they did was they invited socialists and communists from all over Europe to come to what was a conference. So in some senses, no different than, you know, the New Democratic Party or the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party holding a convention, exploring ideas, and in that, at the religious side of the communist or socialist movement still pretty much prevailed. They wanted to set up their statement as what they called a catechism, which was a set of questions, you know, why are you a socialist? And then the reasons, the answers that you would provide. They took that catechism and they told people, take it back to your local cities, explore this with your fellow workers, and then we'll have another conference later. So Engels went to the first conference, but Marx didn't. He couldn't afford to. He was in Brussels. Engels took the catechism back to Manchester, where he was working, and I'm sure as he read it through to the socialists that were there, you know, ridiculed it considerably, and so and then did the same to Marx. So he convinced Marx that you have to be at the second one. So Marx went to the second conference, and there he presented, his sort of ideas, which Engels and Marx had already written in draft form in 1845 in a text that's now been published as The German Ideology. But in that, they sort of say, you know, our premises are the following, and they are, as I sort of mentioned, real individuals, their activities, and their ideas, and then they expand on those ideas. So what Marx was able to do was persuade the League of the Just and all the members there that this sort of new historical materialist perspective was one that they should be adopting. So Marx was then assigned the task of writing the manifesto for the League of the Just. So the manifesto of the Communist Party is the manifesto of the League of the Just, which arose through debate amongst all sorts of different ideas. Being written by Marx, Marx was able to influence what the text would look like, and so it does reflect a lot of the ideas you can see in the German ideology. But he also still had to incorporate ideas that others still wanted to advocate. So in a sense, it is important to understand that the manifesto was written at a particular point in time in the context of a specific debate, and if it were to be written even 10 years later, and certainly 20 years later, probably would have been quite a bit different.
Right. But he went on then, Marx did, to write on Capital or Das Kapital that we know today, and a lot of other unpublished writings and pamphlets and things like that in his later years, and formed a sort of, I mean, could we even call it an ideology, or is that something that's been imposed on him after the fact?
Yeah. So again, I suppose contemporary scholars talk about texts as something that are open, and it's mainly up to the reader to interpret what it is that the author has written. But again, what I emphasize to my students is that whenever you cite something from Marx, then you need to understand when he said it, why he said it, and what the context was. Because you can, if you go through Marx's work, pull out phrases all over the place that in a sense line up as contradictory. But I argue that when Marx wrote, he had specific objectives in mind at different points in time. So again, just to sort of go back to the manifesto, in 1844, Marx is interested in these material issues. So he does a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. So Hegel's philosophy of right is a document that essentially justifies the Prussian state system.
Prussia being in Germany.
Yeah. So as Marx reads through this, he goes through it paragraph by paragraph and sort of outlines where he sees either fallacies or contradictions in Hegel's argument, which leads him ultimately to his idea that there is a class that does represent the emancipation of humanity, that being the proletariat. And what that does then is it leads him into the study of political economy. So it isn't until 1844 that Marx then starts to read political economy seriously. And he is, I'm not sure what the word I should be using here, but he's pretty confident, so confident that he signs a book contract with a guy named Karl Leska to produce a 2-volume critique of political economy in 1845. Well, he doesn't publish the first volume of Capital until 1867.
Right.
But in 1845, he thought, I've got it figured out. But of course, he is somebody who, whenever he has a question, he goes back and reads the primary text. And so he ends up accumulating more and more and more notebooks, and never does put together his critique in 1845. The manifesto in 1848 draws from all of the things that he's been reading, draws from his and Engels' a statement of what their basic premises are. But again, what you see in the manifesto is kind of an overall view of the dynamics of capitalist society, but then those need to be refined more by looking at more and more questions that have to do, in a sense, you talked about a rabbit hole. In a sense, Marx does get drawn down into the rabbit hole of political economy and never really is able to outline and complete the massive project that he thought he would accomplish. Now, at the same time, you have to recognize the massive project he wanted to accomplish was probably something that no individual could do in a single lifetime anyway, because the system is so complex. But also, his desire to kind of get at, well, what are the fundamental relations that I need to understand, led him into, areas of complexity that, he had to try to resolve himself before he would write. And ultimately, so in 1857, there is a big economic crisis. And so Engels writes to him and says, you've got to get your work out now before the crisis gets too large so that people will know where we stand.
Right.
So he puts together 7 notebooks that are often called the Grundrisse, the basic outlines of his critique of political economy. And in there, he outlines what he would like to do for the project as a whole. But again, by the time you get to 1867, when he finally publishes the first volume of Capital, what he's resolved is the most important thing to understand is the production process. So Capital is intended to be 3 volumes. The production process in and of itself. Volume 2 is the circulation process. So production he sees as the creation of material goods that create profit that will ultimately create the system that capitalism is based on. The circulation system, so the second volume, shows the dilemmas of realizing the profit that's been created in the production process. And then the third volume is to try to put those two things together, to try to outline the complexities, which then would lead into, so now I've dealt with the kind of economic infrastructure. Now we need to look at the formation of classes and the impact of class structure, and then the impact of the state on the class structure, and then the impact of world trade. So that's sort of what the plan was to be, which in some ways you can see within the context of the manifesto, but he had a much more detailed idea of trying to explain this whole system, and we end up with volume 1 is polished, and volume 2 and 3 we have Engels' sort of collection of the notes, and then now more recently in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, Marx-Engels comprehensive works, you can now, if you have the time and interest, read the entire notebooks of what made volume 2 and what made volume 3. And there are people who argue, so Maximilian Rubel is one individual who argues that in editing volumes 2 and 3, Engels sort of distorted Marx's position within volumes 2 and 3. And so he had gone to the Institute of Social History, gone through it all, and so publishes in French the manuscripts for volumes 2 and 3. But now, you can consult them in the original.
So Karl Marx wrote an immense amount in his lifetime, and I've read that so much so that, and densely too. Yeah. A lot of this is both philosophy and economy and political economy. Fidel Castro famously said that he couldn't get through it all, and Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese leader, I think famously said he used Marx's works as a pillow. I think that was the best use he could put them to. But what's interesting about all this, and to kind of condense it into something, the former finance minister of Greece after the big economic crisis in that country, Yanis Varoufakis, I think I'm saying that correctly, he said that he wrote an article in The Guardian, the British newspaper, which often tilts to the left, and was originally from Manchester, where Engels was from. He wrote an article for the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, and he said in the beginning of the article that when we read Marx, we find, of course, the poetry of Marx. As you say, when he was a young boy, he would convince his sisters to do work for him because he would give them beautiful stories, and we can see that in his writing. We might give a couple quotes later, but one of the things that Varoufakis says is that when we read Marx, we come across ideas that we're almost ashamed we didn't think of before, and that it's just so salient and so clear for how we understand the world, whether it's class struggle or alienation. So what are just as quickly as we can, what are those key ideas, without going into the rabbit holes, but just what are the key ideas that we can't understand Marx without understanding those ideas?
Okay, good question. But I'll just, before I answer the question, talking about poetry, I should have mentioned this earlier. When Marx was a university student, he used to write romantic poetry to his girlfriend next door, Jenny von Westphalen, who he ultimately married. So he wrote poetry.
Well, I mean, it's almost obvious when he writes his long bit about religion and the opium of the masses, the opium of the people, which is sometimes called the opiate of the masses. Yeah. And we often just quote that one line, but that whole section is highly poetic about the flower on the chain, that we must take the chain off and pluck the living flower and all that stuff. It's hard to avoid how much of a poet as well as a prophet that he tried to be. Anyways. Yeah.
Okay, so what are the key ideas? Well, one of them you've sort of already mentioned, but it's a good example, and that is the whole alienation theme. And the reason why that's important to look at is, in some ways, you can break down alienation into 4 basic principles, which he does at the very end of the Paris manuscript, saying, we're alienated from the product that we are producing. So if you think of a wage worker working in a factory, the product they produce, they don't own and control. They also don't own and control the production process. So we're separated from the production process. We are also, therefore, separated from our own human potential creativity, and therefore we are separated from our own essential humanity. So you can say those 4 points, but the way he gets there is partly through the reading of political economy. So he cites a whole lot of different political economists, including Adam Smith, and particularly Adam Smith, to show that in the material experience of capitalist production, these are the things that happen. But he also then, so he sort of reads Adam Smith through the eyes of the philosopher Hegel, and then reads Hegel through the political economist's eyes of Adam Smith. And so he's then able to use some, pretty interesting philosophical terminology and turn it into a material analysis. So again, reading it in German, he talks about, Vergegenständlichung als Entgegenständlichung. And what that means is the Ver gives you a sense of it's a process. So it is the process of creating objects. So Gegenstand is something that stands opposite you. So the process of creating something that stands opposite you is the same process that Entgegenständlichung is taking it away from you and standing as opposed to you. And read within the context of his critique of Hegel's phenomenology, you get a sense of, wow, what this guy is doing is he's using what were powerful philosophical idealist ideas of how human beings can fulfill themselves and showing how within the actual material world that we live in, we aren't doing that. And what we need to find then is the solution to creating opportunities for the creation of the means of life that allow us to enjoy our full humanity and full creativity. And so you can see then in Marx, I think he does have a conception of human nature, which is one in which we are active individuals who have the potential to be creative, although we also have to meet all of our basic needs. And then once we've met our basic needs, we then start producing our socially constructed wants. And how we will then distribute those socially constructed wants becomes part of the social whole.
So what was, in order to achieve all of the things that you just laid out there, what was Marx's prescription of what to do?
Okay, so, and again, I think his ideas changed over time.
Right.
George Lichtheim, in his History of Marxism, which is a really good history, deals with Marx very well. Lichtheim is very solid, but also then deals with subsequent Marxists afterwards. Points out that really, up until 1871, Marx was very much influenced by the power of the French Revolution. So the Manifesto of 1848 is influenced by that. It has very much a revolutionary tone to it.
Which is interesting because the revolutions of 1848 across Europe followed directly from the French Revolution of 89.
But by 1871, Marx has lived in London and he studied all of the so-called blue books, the inspectors' reports within British society.
Right.
He's seen the potential of democracy in a multi-party state. And so his idea of revolution then, Lichtheim argues, becomes one that becomes more sort of evolutionary. So that if you can mobilize working class individuals to become politically engaged, to create a labor party that is progressive, then through the power of a genuine, open, free democracy, we can debate what our society should look like, what we should be producing, how the profits of that should be allocated. Right. So, there will be many listeners who will think, that guy's crazy. He's talking about Marx as a reformist or a revisionist.
Right.
So in some ways, Edward Bernstein, in writing his, thing on revisionism, I have a great deal of sympathy for that in the sense that I think Marx did move to the idea that a political process can lead to changes that ultimately do revolutionarily transform the society in which we live.
And sorry, go ahead.
And our democracies, in some senses, have done that because the election of Donald Trump has allowed a certain disaffected or committed group to put in power of the most powerful position on the planet, although maybe not so much after China now is able to exert greater influence as the U.S. moves out of different areas.
Yeah.
But and so you can see how the introduction of neoliberalism changed the way the economy was run, changed the way inequality structures have emerged, which isn't to say that can't be redone in a different way. But it really does rely on individuals recognizing what their real true interests are and then following that political action. And of course, that's one thing that Trump has done. He's mobilized a lot of grassroots resistance. So whether they are, Democrats or whatever, they have now realized, wow, I just can't sit in my home anymore and hope that the other people will vote for the guy who's actually going to represent my real interests.
Right, which is interesting because I think the idea that most people have in their head, maybe not about Marx, but about Marxism or Marxism-Leninism as it was in the Soviet Union, is that you have a one-party state which controls everything through what's called a dictatorship of the proletariat and the subjugation of the bourgeoisie, the rising up of the working class to take control of the means of production. Ideas like this that are iconoclastic. They are absolute. And one of the criticisms of, I guess, 20th century Marxism, so from the Russian Revolution of 1917 onwards, is that when Marxist regimes took over in countries all over the world, Russia, China, but other countries as well, that what happened is that the Marxists who were in charge, whether it was the Bolsheviks in Russia or the Maoists in China, said that this theory of Marxism is incontrovertible and cannot be argued. So if we have problems, the problems don't have to do with the theory. The theory is perfect, almost like it's a religious text. That problems must be in execution, and therefore, who's the scapegoat? Who can we blame? Where are the bourgeois elite elements that we still have to root out and find? And of course, I think it's true that every single Marxist regime that has ever called itself Marxist has had mass murder as part of its rise to power, as part of its way of governing, and we can't point to a single, instance of Marxism, which may be different from Marx and his ideas, of not having brutal dictatorships and maybe even totalitarianism. So it's hard to skip over that point, but also to know that Marx changed in his life. He reformed in his life. His ideas would have changed as any other human, and I think we neglect that.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things that you've touched on are important just to sort of underline. One of them is, what were Marx's ideas versus what became Marxism. So you have the sort of consolidation of actually several different Marxisms. So C. Wright Mills wrote a pretty interesting book called Marx and the Marxists. And what he does is he tries to look at Marx's ideas and then how they get deformed by different Marxists afterwards.
Right.
So that's an important point to remember. Secondly, that the regimes that came into power, so whether it was in the Soviet Union or in China, particularly with the Soviet Union, there were a whole lot of different socialist and anarchist movements within the Soviet Union or within Russia. And Lenin was able to successfully mobilize and then consolidate power as a Marxist.
From a very small group of people.
Exactly, yeah. So the Bolsheviks are then able to marginalize and eliminate the Mensheviks because the Mensheviks were the smaller group.
Right.
And then, but because he was focusing on Marx, he's able to emphasize, okay, so Marx is all about rising up the impoverished and putting them in power. But, he then consolidates it into a one-party state with a particular ideology. Then Stalin takes over from Lenin, and Stalin is even more ruthless in consolidating everything around what is an ideology. So it is I would say Marxism-Leninism becomes an ideology that's very different than Marx's ideas.
Right.
And Mao, to a certain extent, does the same thing. Chairman Mao interprets Marx, and so Mao's texts then become the sacred texts, and the next most sacred texts are Marx's texts. But again, those texts are are skewed in a way that favor a particular party that's in power.
Yeah.
And those aren't really, I don't think, Marx's ideas. They are, in some ways, they're distortions that use the political cachet of Marx and then try to use that to justify whatever particular decisions are being made by those in power.
And I think that cachet is somewhat founded upon his ability to write well and write persuasively and write poetically. Because, I mean, when's the last time we could think of an economist or a philosopher who essentially attained religious status over billions of people around the world? For almost 200 years now. I mean, not 200 years. I mean, since he started writing, so let's say a century and a half. I mean, that's a profound effect that he's had. I honestly think that we're going to have a second conversation because we've dug into what on earth has gone on, but we need to really still ask the question, what on earth is going on through the lens of Marx? So if you're okay with that, I think we need to have a part 2.
Okay, sure. I'd be happy to do that.
And before we do, though, I'm going to just leave us with a quote that you can respond to, which will hopefully position us for part 2. And this is from Marx. He said that constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty, and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. It sounds to me like he's not just describing 1848, he's describing 2018. He's describing this moment right now, this almost unfettered interruption and disturbance. And I think you've mentioned Donald Trump's election several times now. I think that's almost key. And I think that could position us to ask, what on earth is going on? And what does Marx have to say about it?
Yeah, okay. So that quote is from the manifesto. And in the manifesto, what Marx does is he paints what I call 2 great titans. So one is the bourgeoisie, and he really does extol on the massive productive potential that the bourgeoisie has brought into existence. Productive power that surpasses even the wildest dreams of humanity. But at the same point in time, he also then shows that, all fixed, fast, frozen relations with their chain of ancient and venerable prejudices are swept aside. All new formed ones are antiquated before they can ossify. All that's solid melts to air. And man is now forced to confront his real conditions of existence. So what Marx points out in the manifesto is that modernity is a new epoch of rapid continual change. And what has happened from 1848 to 2018 is that the processes of social change have become more and more rapid. And with the introduction of digital technology, digital information, where now we can have access to information anywhere in the globe instantaneously, that really does, this whole idea of all that's solid melts to air, like it's true. All that's solid has melted to air. We communicate instantaneously. And so it's that instantaneous connection, but then what that also means then is, I think anyway, is the role of ideas becomes much more profound. And it's ideas that then are able to consolidate in simplified forms. So taking a complex world and consolidating into something simple. Whether it is the branding of, Adidas shoes, that is what kind of creates the world we live in now. Unraveling the onion is what we have to do, but what we're doing is we're buying the onion.
That's a terrific place to leave us. Professor Beamish, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
All right. Until next time. All right. That is our show for the evening. Thank you for listening to What on Earth is Going On, broadcast to you on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston and streaming live at cfrc.ca. Remember that you can follow this show on social media at Wogo Show, WOEGO Show, for What on Earth is Going On Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I would love to get your feedback, your questions, your suggestions, but most of all, I hope you'll keep this conversation going. Now that we've covered so much historical ground with Marx today, next week we're going to be asking what on earth is going on today, now, through the lens of Karl Marx's writings and ideas, once again with Dr. Rob Beamish of Queen's University. And now it's time for your quote of the week. History repeats itself, first as a tragedy, then as a farce. You guessed it, that was Karl Marx. See you next week. Good night. Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit wogoshow.com, that's WOEGO show.com, or search for What on Earth is Going On in your podcast provider. See you next time.